A state changes the rules to favor one side. Another state sees that and decides that it has to respond to restore what it calls balance. So it moves to change its own rules. Not at the end of the decade, not through the system voters approved, but through a targeted exception. The justification? Fairness. Because if other states are gaining an advantage, then fairness means correcting it. But that creates a problem. What happens when restoring fairness requires suspending the very system designed to guarantee it? That's the question here. This is the Section 451 brief. Here we don't argue positions. We test whether the structure behind them actually holds, because most political arguments don't break down at the level of opinion. They break down at the level of definitions, mechanisms, constraints. And this one hinges on a single word: fairness. Here's the situation. Democrats in Virginia are moving to redraw the state's congressional districts, not through the existing system, but by temporarily setting it aside. The stated goal is to restore fairness, specifically to counter what's happening in other states, places like Texas, where maps are drawn to heavily favor one party. And the logic is straightforward. If one side is maximizing its advantage wherever it can, then fairness requires responding in kind, balancing that out, correcting that national picture. But that's only half the story, because Virginia already has a system voters approved, a system designed to prevent exactly this kind of partisan map drawing. And the proposal on the table doesn't work within that system. It sets it aside, and the expected result isn't subtle. A delegation that could shift from something close to evenly split to one that heavily favors Democrats, in some projections as extreme as a 10-to-1 advantage. So the conflict here isn't just political, it's structural. On one side, fairness defined by outcomes. If the numbers don't look right, you change the system to fix them. On the other, fairness defined by constraints. Rules set in advance, applied regardless of who benefits, and not rewritten when they become inconvenient. So this isn't just a disagreement about maps. It's a disagreement about what fairness actually means, and whether it still means anything once the rules can be suspended to achieve it. To understand the argument, you have to start at the national level, because in the U.S. House of Representatives, control isn't determined by how fair any one state is internally. It's determined by total seats, and those seats are shaped by how each state draws its districts. So when states like Texas draw maps that heavily favor one party, that advantage doesn't stay constrained. It compounds. It stacks across states. And over time, it can shift control of the House itself. From that perspective, Virginia isn't an isolated case. It's part of a national system. And that system rewards whichever side is willing to maximize its advantage. So the logic becomes straightforward. If one side is aggressively drawing maps to secure more seats, and the other side refuses to respond, then the second side isn't taking a principled stand, it's conceding power. Not because voters rejected them, but because they chose not to use the tools available to them. And in a system where control determines policy, that has real consequences. Legislation, committee control, national direction. So the argument follows, fairness doesn't mean unilateral restraint. Fairness means balance. And if balance requires using the same tools, then those tools should be used, even if they're imperfect. Because the goal isn't a perfectly clean process. The goal is an outcome that reflects a fair distribution of power. But that argument depends on a specific assumption, that fairness is determined by outcomes, even if achieving those outcomes requires changing the rules. Because Virginia already answered this question once. In 2020, Virginia voters approved a constitutional amendment. About 65.7% voted in favor, and they did it during a presidential election year, when turnout reached about 75% of registered voters in the state, according to official election data. That matters, because it tells you what kind of decision this was. This wasn't a low participation vote driven by a narrow slice of the electorate. It was a high turnout election, millions of voters, broad participation, and the most representative electorate you're going to get in a modern cycle. And what they chose was specific. They took map drawing power away from the legislator and replaced it with a constrained system. A bipartisan commission backed by the courts if necessary. When that process failed to produce a map, the court stepped in, appointed special masters, and finalized one. And that court-approved map is the one currently in place. But the proposal on the table doesn't work within that system. It sets it aside, temporarily. And it does it through a special election, held off-cycle rather than through a regular general election. So now the question isn't abstract anymore, it's immediate. If fairness requires suspending the system voters just created and doing it through a process that involves fewer votes than the one that established it, was that system ever a standard? Or was it only the standard when it produced acceptable results? Now we can isolate the structure. There are two competing definitions of fairness operating at the same time. The first one is outcome-based. In that model, fairness is measured by results. Do the numbers look right? Does the balance of power match what it's supposed to be? If not, the system can be adjusted to correct it, even if that means changing the rules. The second is process-based. In that model, fairness is defined by the rules themselves. Rules set in advance, applied consistently, and not changed simply because one side doesn't like the results. But those rules aren't arbitrary, they're designed to do something. To produce districts that reflect the actual population of the state. Not just who can win the most seats, but who actually lives there, who votes there, and how those voters are distributed across the map. That's what the constraints are for. They're not procedural for their own sake. They exist to prevent one side from concentrating its voters efficiently while spreading the other side out with just enough to dilute them. Because once that happens, representation stops tracking the population and starts tracking the map maker. And that's the hinge. The moment you allow the rules to be suspended to produce a better outcome, they're not rules anymore, they're tools. Something you use when they benefit you and set aside when they don't. And once that shift happens, the system doesn't hold. Because the rule is no longer follow the system, it becomes follow the system unless the outcome is unacceptable. And once that exception exists, it becomes a mechanism, one that any future majority can use for any justification at any time. Once that mechanism exists, every future majority inherits it and uses it, because there's no longer a constraint stopping them. At that point, the system isn't protecting representation anymore, it's managing it. At that point, the system doesn't stabilize, it escalates. Because once the rules can be set aside to produce a better outcome, there's no reason not to do it again, and no reason for the other side not to respond the same way. So it starts as a correction, turns into a cycle. Each side adjusting the rules when it has the power to do it. Each change justified by what the other side has already done. And the original constraint, the one the voters approved, stops functioning as a constraint at all. It becomes optional, something that applies only when it's convenient. So the question isn't whether a new map can produce a more favorable outcome, it's whether fairness can still be defined by a system. If that system can be suspended the moment it becomes inconvenient, because it can, then fairness isn't a rule anymore, it's a strategy. And once fairness becomes a strategy, it isn't restoring it, it's replacing it. The purpose of the system wasn't just to follow rules, it was to produce representation that reflects Virginia. Its voters, its communities, its actual political distribution. When those constraints are removed, that representation breaks down. Not evenly, not proportionally, but selectively, concentrating one side's power while diluting the other. So this isn't just about process, it's about what that process was protecting. And once that protection is gone, what you're left with isn't a fair map, it's a less representative one. That's the standard here. That's how we test the structure. And this is the Section 451 brief.